In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, grant us concentration that we may learn, listen, understand, have a peaceful mind, and remember that you're with us always. Amen. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the second part of photosynthesis, which is really beginning to talk about the light reactions. So if we're going to talk about the light reactions, we need to start by talking about light. What is light, and how do the plants collect that light? And so to start with, we'll start with a little review. I'm sure some of you have had this before. When we talk about light, we talk about light in two forms. It's both a wave-like form, and it's also a particle form. Okay, I'm going to draw two waves here. And we're going to talk about the difference between those two waves. Okay. So light in its most complete definition would be one form of electromagnetic radiation. And so the electromagnetic radiation is going to be determined by looking at the wavelength of light. So the wavelength of light, we could say, is going to be the length from the top to the bottom, back to the bottom again, or you know what I mean there. And we would say that's the wavelength, often abbreviated by the Greek letter lambda. And so the wavelength of light is going to be important because this determines how much energy that the photons are carrying. And so the longer the wavelength, the less energy that's present there. The shorter the wavelength, the more energy. And that's going to be important because, as we'll see in a little bit, for plants to capture light energy, there needs to be a certain amount of energy present there. And so when we talk about light, it's part of this electromagnetic spectrum in which it goes from very small wavelengths, such as the gamma rays, X-rays, and UV light, and all three of these are very short wavelengths and have a very high energy amount. In fact, we could say, and as a preview moving ahead, they have too much energy. Okay? So the plants can't use that energy. On the opposite end, the very long wavelengths where we have the radio waves, microwaves would be out there, infrared light, same idea, that these are going to have too little energy, very long wavelengths, too little energy. And so they're not going to be able to have enough energy to excite the electrons to allow the plants to collect them. In the middle here we have a small range from 400 to 700 nanometers, 740, roughly 400 to 700, in which we refer to as photosynthetically active radiation. That means that this is the range of light, or the range of the electromagnetic radiation, that has just the right amount of energy to be able to excite the electrons. And so that light energy can be captured and is able to be used by the plants in their photosynthetic reactions. So that's the light we're focused on. And again, you've probably seen this before, seen it abbreviated as Roy G. Biv, where we go from red being the highest or longest wavelength, lowest amount of energy that can be captured, down to violet, which has very short wavelengths and has the most energy present there. I always think it's interesting to point out at this point in time that the photosynthetically active radiation has the same energy ranges, if we're going to look at it that way, the same energy ranges that are going to allow for the capturing of your eyes, so it's the visible spectrum, the same colors that we can see. So this is the idea of light. Keep in mind the most important point here is that the longer the wavelength, less energy the light contains. The shorter the wavelength, the more energy that it's contained. Okay? And so when we talk about light in this, how does light energy, or how is the light energy collected? Well, when we talk about this, it's going to involve the interaction with the electrons that are present in the pigments. We'll talk about the pigments in a little bit, but the different pigments are going to be able to interact with the light and be energized by that light to be able to allow the energy to be contained. And we refer to this as the photoelectric effect. The photoelectric effect, in this case, what we mean is the interaction of the photons with the electron will cause a shift. So in this diagram that we have here, we're showing it as steps. So each step is a different electron shell on the outside of the atom. To move electrons from a lower shell to a higher shell takes a certain amount of energy. And so if there's the right amount of energy, it's going to be able to move up one step. And those would be energized electrons. That's the photoelectric effect. We're energizing or activating those electrons. And so when this happens, it's going to provide energy that can then be used by the light reactions. In the similar way, when electrons are moved from a higher shell to a lower shell, we see energy being released. And so this is going to happen during the process. Now here's the connection to light. As I've already mentioned, short wavelengths, energy, more energy present. Longer wavelengths, there's less energy present. In the case of the photoelectric effect, we're going to talk about having just the right amount of energy. So wavelengths that are too short, again, we're talking about UV light. And as I mentioned before, the gamma rays. That's going to have too much energy, okay? And so what's mostly going to happen is as that interacts with the electrons, it's going to be reflected off. Now, if it's too much energy, because this is just like a step, it could actually move the electron off completely, and that electron would be lost. In the short wavelength range, this would be the infrared and the radio waves. In that case, there's not enough energy. So there's not enough energy to move the electron up to the next shell, and so it's just sort of retained inside that shell. And so inside that one area, there's not enough energy to electron. So I like to think of this in a fun way as being the Goldilocks effect. Okay? Short wavelengths are too hot, so we can't capture that energy. Long waves are too cold, so we don't have enough energy present there. In the visible spectrum, it's just right. So there's just the right amount of energy to cause the excitation of the electrons. And so that energy then can be captured into a certain range. Well, what are the molecules that are doing this? Well, on the plants or in the plants, okay, I always like to ask what color are plants, and of course you know plants are green. Because the plants are green, the reason the plants are green, I should say, is because the primary pigment in the plant structures, again, we're kind of on the thylakoid membrane is where these pigments are going to be present. And so they're going to be green because the most abundant pigment present is going to be chlorophyll. Okay? And so why is chlorophyll green? Well, because it's going to absorb light that's in the wavelengths that aren't green, and it reflects the light that are in the green waves, or combined together form green. So if you follow the line absorbance, so what you're looking for is absorbance, the amount of light that's absorbed, versus the wavelengths going from violet down here out to red. Okay? And if you follow the chain for chlorophyll, which is the solid green line here, you'll notice it absorbs very highly here, and it absorbs a lot of light in here. So in the blue-purple range, blue-violet range, it's going to absorb light, and in the orange-red range, it absorbs light. So what is it reflecting back? Well, it's this middle part here, which, again, if we look through that, we'll see that it's going to end up forming green light. So the light that's not being used is going to be present in there. The other pigments that are here, well, chlorophyll B we can start with, and you'll notice chlorophyll B, roughly the same, a little further into the blue there, and a peak a little closer to the yellow. It's going to have a slightly more bluish tint to it because it's sort of reflecting more light in that range. But it's going to have a similar spectrum to chlorophyll A. The other pigments, some of them that you should be familiar with, beta carotene, the carotenoids, carrots, that's why they're orange. Okay. The other ones that are shown here, you may not be familiar with the name, but during lab you had a chance to see that they were present, in particular in the spinach leaves. So what's the role of these other pigments? We could also refer to them as accessory pigments. The accessory pigments are going to increase the range of light that can be absorbed. More range of light means more energy can be absorbed. So these other pigments that are in there, you can see, will absorb in light that's in the green range, in the orange-yellow range, and luting through there. Okay. And so they're still present in the green plants. It's just our primary pigment that's present there is going to be chlorophyll, which means most of the plants are green. Okay. So this is the range where it's absorbing light, is where the energy that's being captured is going to be present to be able to allow the process of the light reactions to occur. As I've already mentioned, chlorophyll is the primary pigment. And so chlorophyll is important because it's going to be the pigment that collects most of the light energy. As we'll see in a little bit, it's also important because it forms the reaction center of the photosystem that we'll talk about in a little bit. And so we can break chlorophyll's structure into two parts. The first is the porphyrin ring, okay, and that's up on the top. And the porphyrin ring is going to be the area that actually absorbs light. Notice the double bonds that are present in it. The double bonds present there are going to allow for the shuffling of electrons and the movement of the excited electrons. So these double bonds are important for that particular reason. You can also notice something else about the porphyrin ring is it forms a flat surface. So it forms a flat surface, increases the surface area, which means we're able to collect more light energy. So this is going to be where the light is being absorbed. The other thing you'll note is in the center of this porphyrin ring is a magnesium ion. And this magnesium ion is going to be important primarily for stabilizing the structure of the molecule, but metal ions will also be important in the movement of electrons. So it sort of has a double role there. But primarily we're focusing here on its role in stabilizing the ring structure that we have. So that's the first part of it. The second part of this is the hydrocarbon tail. Okay? And the hydrocarbon tail is pretty simple. Its role is it's going to anchor the chlorophyll molecule to the membrane. Okay? And so that allows the chlorophyll molecule to remain attached to that thylakoid membrane where it will function to collect the light energy. What happens to the light energy? Well, as I've already mentioned, we're talking about the photosystems, okay? And this is a look at a photosystem that is complete. And we're going to tell you right now that the photosystem is made up of two different parts, okay? The outer portion is made up of the antenna complex. And the antenna complex is going to be the portion of the photosystem that will contain a high concentration of the pigments, and they're going to act to collect the light. So all around here would be the location where we see the antenna complex. Okay? And so the antenna complex's role is just like an antenna on a radio or on a television. We don't use that a lot anymore, but that's sort of old school, if you will. but the antenna complex collects the light energy. It's then going to shuffle the light energy through these pigment molecules to the center portion. And the center portion is the reaction center. And this reaction center is where we're going to actually have the process of the electron transport chain beginning. The reaction center is going to contain a special chlorophyll molecule. It's special in the sense that this is going to allow for the beginning of electron transport to contain. And so the electron transport will then begin at that to move from the reaction center using the light energy that's collected. So the energy that's transferred here through the antenna complex is not moved as electrons. It's simply the transfer of energy between the pigments into the reaction center where we can begin the process of electron transport. Okay. One last note that I want to make about this is that we're going to see in this particular process that there needs to be an electron source. And so where we have the electron donor here, for the overall process, water will serve as the electron source. And if you remember from our overall reactions we talked about, it was the water that was being oxidized to oxygen that's going to be the source of electrons. And these electrons are then going to be able to be used by the electron transport chain throughout the process of photosynthesis, in particular the light reactions in the formation of ATP and the reduction of NADP for the formation of NADPH that can be used by the dark reactions. Okay, and so when we talk about the photosystems, we need to be aware, first of all, that there are two photosystems. And yes, this is about to get confusing a little bit, but I think it'll be okay, is that we name them backwards. Photosystem 2 is where we start, and photosystem 1 is going to be where the present part of this is to move through for the formation of ATP and the process. Okay. Now I need you to think back. Okay, when we talk about electron transport, because that's what we're doing here, think back to the electron transport chain in metabolism, talked about connected to glycolysis and Krebs cycle. What was the purpose of that? Well, the purpose of the electron transport chain was ATP synthesis. And if you remember, this is a chemiosmotic process. Okay. And what we mean by that is that we use a chemical gradient to be able to form, or we use a chemical gradient, osmotic, to form a chemical form of energy. In this case, we're using a proton gradient, similar to what we've seen in the electron transport chain, in the formation of ATP. And so when we talk about the movement of electrons through the photosystems, this is going to be where we get to the involvement of the process. So I'd like to stop this video here, and then I will pick up with the electron transport and the photosystem arrangement in the next video. As always, if you have questions, please post those on the discussion board on Schoology, and or contact me with those questions so that we can make sure they're getting answered. Thank you.